What if the only thing standing between an entire Allied platoon and total annihilation was one man, one rifle, and a technique so cunning that it turned the enemy's own patience into a weapon against them? In the frozen, blood-soaked ruins of Ortona, Italy, in late December 1943, during one of the most brutal urban battles of the entire Second World War, a scenario unfolded that would later be studied in military academies across the world. Not because of superior numbers, not because of air support or armored vehicles, but because one soldier understood something fundamental about fear, silence, and the deadly psychology of the sniper's mind. The Battle of Ortona, fought between December 20th and 28th, 1943, by the 1st Canadian Infantry Division against elite German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division under the command of Major General Richard Heydrich, transformed the ancient Italian coastal town into a labyrinth of rubble, broken walls, and invisible death, earning it the grim nickname Little Stalingrad. In this landscape of collapsed buildings and whispering ruins, the German High Command had positioned snipers with surgical precision, knowing that every Canadian soldier who dared to move through the streets of Ortona would be walking into a crossfire with no escape. What happened inside that shattered city over one frozen 5-hour period is one of the most remarkable and least told stories of individual tactical brilliance in the entire war. If this story already has you leaning forward, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. Subscribe right now, hit that like button, and share this video with someone who loves real history. Not the sanitized version, but the raw, breathing humankind. And drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know about the Battle of Ortona before today. We read every single one. By December 1943, the Italian campaign had already shattered the illusions of those who believed the Allied advance northward would be swift and clean. General Harold Alexander's 15th Army Group had been grinding through the Italian peninsula since the landings in Sicily in July of that year, and every kilometer northward had been purchased in blood. The German Winter Line, anchored by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's masterful defensive positioning across the spine of the Apennines and along the Adriatic coast, was designed not merely to slow the Allies but to bleed them until the political will to continue collapsed entirely. Ortona sat on the Adriatic coast of the Abruzzo region, perched above the sea on a promontory of ancient stone, its narrow medieval streets dating back centuries. And those same streets, now choked with the wreckage of shelled buildings, had become the perfect killing ground for German paratroopers who had turned urban warfare into an art form. The Fallschirmjäger were not ordinary soldiers. They were among the most fanatically trained and ideologically committed fighters in the entire German military, veterans of Crete, the Eastern Front, and North Africa, men who had been taught to fight until the last breath because surrender in their culture was not a concept that existed. They had rigged buildings with booby traps, collapsed walls onto advancing Canadians with demolition charges, and turned every doorway, every window, every pile of rubble into a potential ambush point, making the advance through Ortona a nightmare of attrition that cost the Canadians over 500 casualties in just 8 days of fighting. The Canadian soldiers pressing into Ortona belonged primarily to the loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, supported by the Three Rivers Regiment's tanks, and they had developed a technique called mouse-holing, blasting holes through the walls of connected buildings to move from house to house without exposing themselves to the death that waited in the streets. This innovation kept men alive, but it could not solve every problem that Ortona presented, because while the Canadians could move horizontally through walls, the German snipers owned the vertical dimension entirely, perched in collapsed upper floors, in bell towers, in the skeletal remains of buildings that had been reduced to nothing more than a few standing walls and a roofline with a shadow inside it. German sniper doctrine during the Second World War was extraordinarily sophisticated. Snipers were trained not just to shoot but to think, to construct psychological traps, to use sound and movement as bait, to work in coordinated teams that covered each other's positions and created overlapping fields of observation that made any exposed area a triple-threat kill zone. In the ruins of Ortona, a group of 14 German snipers had established a mutually supporting defensive perimeter within a cluster of bombed-out structures near the Piazza Municipale, covering every approach with interlocking fields of fire so that no single point of cover could protect an advancing soldier from all angles simultaneously. A textbook deployment that had already claimed several Canadian lives and effectively frozen an entire section of the advance. It was into this situation that a rifleman whose story has been partially preserved in the war diaries of the loyal Edmonton Regiment found himself not by choice but by the brutal mathematics of attrition that had reduced his section to himself and 2 wounded comrades who could not move. The specific accounts recorded in the regimental diaries from late December 1943 describe a soldier, a corporal from Alberta, who, rather than attempting to withdraw under fire or call for reinforcements who would only expose themselves to the same killing ground, chose to do something that defied conventional military logic and reached instead into something older and more primal. He chose to disappear. The echo method, as it would later be described by survivors and analysts who pieced together what had happened from the physical evidence and the testimony of those who witnessed its aftermath, was not a formal military technique with a name in any training manual. It was an improvised psychological and tactical system built on one core insight: a sniper can only be patient for as long as he believes his target is real. The corporal understood that the Germans had been trained to wait, to resist the impulse to fire at a silhouette or a shadow unless the shot was certain, because a missed shot revealed a position, but that same discipline, that same rigorous training, could be turned against them if the bait was convincing enough and the timing precise enough to prevent them from coordinating their responses. For the first hour, the corporal did nothing. He lay completely still in the rubble, studying the ruins surrounding the piazza with the patience of a man who had been born on a farm in the Alberta foothills and had spent his youth learning that the land gave its secrets only to those who could be still enough to receive them. He catalogued every position he suspected. A flash of reflected light from the second floor of a collapsed palazzo to the northeast, a shadow that moved with too much deliberateness behind a broken cornice to the west, the sound of a boot shifting on loose plaster from somewhere above and to his left. He was constructing in his mind a map not of the ruins but of the minds inside them, where each sniper believed he was invisible, how each one was oriented, which directions each would be watching, what would make each one choose to reveal himself. He had 2 dead soldiers nearby whose equipment he could use, and he had a rifle, a supply of ammunition, and the 5 remaining hours of usable winter light on December 27, 1943, one day before the official end of organized German resistance in Ortona, though no one knew that yet. The echo method worked like this: the corporal would create a movement, a helmet pushed on a stick, a coat draped over rubble and tugged by a cord, a sound made at one location while he had already moved silently to another, and then, instead of waiting for the shot and trying to trace the muzzle flash in real time, he would count. He had observed, over weeks of combat in Italy, that German snipers operating in coordinated teams would communicate with each other using brief signals after a confirmed kill, a small movement or a whistle pattern so subtle it was nearly indistinguishable from the ambient sounds of a ruined city. Nearly, but not quite, to someone who had been listening to nothing else for an hour. Each false target he created drew a shot, and each shot drew a signal, and each signal told him where 2 snipers were instead of 1, because the shooter revealed himself with his muzzle blast and the observer revealed himself with his confirmation. Over the course of 5 hours, through 18 separate deceptions, each one more elaborate than the last, each one placed in a slightly different relationship to the previous ones so that the Germans could not identify the pattern, the corporal worked his way methodically around the perimeter, using the ruins themselves as cover, crawling through mouse holes that the Canadians had made in previous days, and eliminating each confirmed position with a single shot placed with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already done the mathematics before he pulled the trigger. By the time the winter light began failing over the Adriatic coast and the ancient stones of Ortona were cooling toward another brutal night, all 14 German snipers who had frozen that section of the Canadian advance were dead or incapacitated, eliminated not by artillery, not by a flanking assault, not by a coordinated military operation involving multiple units and officer-level planning, but by one man who had understood something that all the tactical doctrine in the world could not fully capture: that the most dangerous weapon in any battle is not the one that kills fastest, but the one that thinks longest. This is the midpoint of this story, and if you've made it this far, you already know that this channel is committed to bringing you history that hits differently. So subscribe if you haven't already, like this video so more people can find it, share it with someone who thinks they know everything about World War II, and tell us in the comments what surprised you most about the tactics used in Ortona. The information you're about to hear in the second half of this story is even more remarkable. The aftermath of that 5-hour engagement sent a shock through the German defensive command in Ortona that was disproportionate to the numbers involved. Major General Richard Heydrich, commanding the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division from his headquarters further back from the city, received the reports of what had happened near the Piazza Municipale with a combination of professional respect and alarm, because what the corporal had done was not merely eliminate 14 soldiers, it had broken the psychological architecture of an entire defensive system. The German sniper network in Ortona had functioned because of mutual confidence. Each sniper trusted that if he was spotted and fired upon, His colleagues would immediately engage the threat from multiple angles and suppress it before it could develop into a sustained attack. What the Echo method had done was exploit the very communication signals that created that confidence, using the network's own coordination language as a targeting system, turning the strength of the German defensive doctrine into its fatal vulnerability. When the survivors of other German units in Ortona learned what had happened, the effect on morale was measurable. Not because 14 men had died, which was a routine horror of that campaign, but because the manner of their deaths suggested that their training, their discipline, their professional identity as elite paratroopers had somehow been used against them, and that knowledge created a doubt that discipline alone could not suppress. The Battle of Ortona ended officially on December 28, 1943, when the last organized German resistance collapsed and Canadian soldiers of the loyal Edmonton Regiment raised their flag over the ruins of the city. The victory came at enormous cost. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division suffered over 650 casualties in the Battle of the Moreau River and Ortona combined, and the town itself was largely destroyed, its ancient buildings reduced to rubble by a combination of German demolition and Allied artillery. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 8th Army of which the Canadians were a part, acknowledged in his dispatches that the fighting in Ortona had been among the most ferocious urban combat of the entire Italian campaign, comparable in intensity and tactical complexity to anything that had occurred in the European theater. The corporal from Alberta was mentioned in the regimental war diary not with the elaborate official language of a formal commendation but with the simple, understated notations of a document written under pressure and time by men who had too much to record and too little space to record it. A few lines, a reference to the engagement near the piazza, a note about the effectiveness of the tactic, the kind of entry that in another age would have generated books and films, but in the context of that war was just one more astonishing thing that had happened on one more terrible day. His name has been partially obscured by the damage of time and the imperfect preservation of records. A reminder that history's most extraordinary chapters are sometimes written by men whose names we are still trying to recover from the silence that follows great battles. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you didn't know before, then do 3 things right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Like this video and share it with someone who deserves to know that history is full of men like this corporal, brilliant, patient, and utterly forgotten. And leave a comment telling us what part of this story stayed with you, because the next time we tell a story this powerful, we want to know you're here to hear it.